outlet, an avenue for frustrations, an emotional catharsis, if you will, that allowed me to cope with the insanity I saw within myself and those around me, alongside the inhumanity in the world we both called home. Combining my love of haiku poetry, which in its simplest form says much but suggests more, I took my rap-styled, almost childlike prose, and I created an art form I dubbed rap haiku. It was obvious I needed an artist. I mean, nobody was going to be moved by rap haiku poetry and stickmen. I began to strip originally with a creative artist who never quite clicked with the concept I had in mind. But then came Junko. Straight off the plane from Japan, she was like a breath of fresh air for street poet Ray. Her highly disciplined Eastern style, heavily symbolic artwork gelled perfectly with my undisciplined Western styled verse from the street, and provided, if you will, a visual link between the haiku of her native land with the rap-style prose of my urban roots. She thought street poet Ray was kakoe, which was cool, and I, in return, thought her artwork was, oh, how would you say, a yoi, major yoi, very good. You pop down a beer and you drive real fast cause you think the good times are gonna last, but then a siren wails and there's a light in your face and a DUI becomes a big disgrace. A PSA from Street Poet Ray: don't drink and drive.
The Canadian comic book industry is really booming right now, but for years there was, well, pretty well nothing. You had to live in New York or Los Angeles to get work. But there was a time during World War II when there was a booming Canadian comic book industry. One of the people who was involved back then was Ed Furness. Ed was the artist for one of the top Canadian superheroes of the 1940s, Freelance. Let's talk to Ed. Punch him up here. Ed? Hello,
yeah.
Ed.
Yeah, here I am.
A sec, I'm getting you. Let me lock you down here. There we go. Ed, it's Commander Rick. I wanted to ask you about the Canadian comic book industry during the war. How did it get started? And why did it get started?
Well, it got started because the Canadian government, in their wisdom, cut off certain publications from the United States. An entrepreneur-type writer in Toronto, Ted McCall, a dear friend of mine, had done comic strips. And he got the bright idea that he would take the old metal plates, cut them up, and cut them down to size and put them into a comic book. He approached Harold Sinnott of Sinnott News with the idea, and Sinnott was gung-ho, ready to go at all times on any new idea, and they did. And trouble was, they didn't have material to last much more than 6 or 7 months. So Ted McCall, being the writer that he was, immediately set about creating a new character. And that was where I came into the picture. I became the illustrator for that.
Your background was in commercial art, right? Before...
Yes, that's right. Though I had done animation before that.
Oh, for who?
Bryant Fryer Associates, an absolutely nameless company, which was back in 1933. And we ran out of money.
Ed, you're over 30 now, aren't you?
Yes, I'm...
Am I guessing right here?
Yes, you are guessing right.
Okay.
Way over 30.
The Canadian comic book industry got how big during the war? How many people were involved? Was it very big, very small, or?
Well, I can only speak for Anglo-American Publishing, which was the company that Harold Sinnott owned, and we were about 40, I guess, of whom 12 were artists.
And today you have inked by, story by, there's a whole variety of people. Was it the same back then, or did you do everything?
No, I did right at the very beginning, but obviously, because production is a hard taskmaster, one person couldn't possibly do it. And so I was forced to find other artists. Well, there weren't any, and I was getting kids off the street almost, you know, and so then I devised the system of penciling the stories, much as you do in animation, the storyboards.
Right. And
get these kids, the ones that had most talent, got to ink in. And it was pretty bad stuff, really. Well, it was. Obviously, it would be. I mean, they were inexperienced. But as time went on, we got a production system going where I did the storyboards. One person did all the lettering. Another person drew all the backgrounds. The ones who could ink better than the others got to do principal characters, and the other ones did secondary and tertiary characters.
And how many comics were you turning out? I mean, what was the rate? One a day, one a week? Or?
Comic books, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, how many issues of
Oh, we were doing 7 comic books a month in total.
Did you feel at the time you were creating anything great, or did you feel it was just, you were just having a good time doing it?
I would like to say that we thought we were really at the beginning of something great and that we were making Canadian history. The fact of the matter was that it was a job, and a very difficult one, too.
Why were they called the Canadian Whites?
Well, because originally they were just in black and white. And we started, the first copies came out around July, I guess, of 1941. And it wasn't until 4 years later that we went into color.
What do you think of today's comics? You've read Arkham Asylum and some of the real state-of-the-art ones, I know.
Oh, yes, I love them. I think they're great stuff. And I just wish I were 50 years younger and could get back into the industry.
Oh, come on, you're never too old.
Well, I don't know. I'd love to draw them.
The artwork I mean, the artwork seems to me just to be so much more sophisticated, and...
Well, it is, too.
And there's also a real broad range of style with the alternate comics around. I mean, people are just doing incredible things.
You see, we were criticized for this mass production technique, but really I had no choice but to go that way. So we didn't develop any star artists at all, because the whole thing was homogenized. The same artists were drawing just about everything.
Did both men and women work at Anglo-American, or?
Yes, my staff, the part that I was interested in were, and because these kids had had no experience whatsoever, we just sort of put a lasso out there on the street and pulled young people in, and they had to be taught. It sounds incredible today with the way the artists are drawing today, but we had no choice in the matter. The men and women, I think out of the 12 artists, I usually kept a staff of 12, 8 would have been women and 4 men.
Oh, so you were an equal opportunity employer way back then.
Yeah, per force.
Were comics censored back during the war? I mean, not just militarily censored, but in terms of amount of violence you could show and so on, things like that?
Matter of fact, our philosophy from the very beginning was to do everything without a great deal of violence. Sure, there'd be a little throwing of a punch here and there, but it was done mostly by smart.
Why? Because the war was on and there was enough violence in the world? Or?
Not that really, Rick. It was because we felt that the over-violent American comics were perhaps not in the best interest of the young people. And as we said before, that was our market.
What was the first comic that got the first Canadian white that got transferred and became a Canadian color?
Well, the first one of Anglo-Americans, anyway, was Freelance.
Oh, yours?
Yeah, that was the bellwether of the flock, and we always tried everything out on Freelance. But the very next one of Grand Slam, Whiz, Three Aces, they all went into full color.
And what were the storylines of these comics during World War II? Was it mainly get the Nazis and the saboteurs?
Oh, well, certainly Freelance was. He was a person of unknown origin, and he just turned out to be exactly what his name implies, and that is a freelance whose sword could be hired by anybody as long as it was in the interest of right and the good guys.
Back in the 1940s, comic books were considered a kid's art form or more of an adult's art form?
No.
Or what was the market for Canadian comics?
Kids. 10 cents a book, you know. And
10 cents. Whoa. And what are they worth today? What would one copy of Freelance be worth today?
I think volume 1, number 1 is on the market something like $15, $18.
Street Poet Ray.
I took the comic strips and began personally visiting the local colleges in the San Diego area to see if they would carry it in their publications. Their response was so encouraging that I decided to do a direct mailing to colleges all over the United States. The result, Street Poet Ray picked up an additional 13 colleges. Not bad when you consider we only targeted the top 200. I felt great. I mean, finally, I was getting what was in here and up here out to a mass audience of 700,000 students a week, and they were reacting favorably to the word from the street. It felt terrific. The strips were being received so well by the colleges that at the prompting of friends in the media, I did a series of 5 PSAs, or public service announcements, for airing on local TV stations. Well, at least they started locally. We were contacted by the campus network, who had heard about the PSAs from folks in San Diego. And before long, we were being beamed onto 300 college campuses via satellite, across the USA, at the rate of 1 spot an hour, 24 hours a day, for a cumulative audience of 23 million students a week. We were also being aired on Storer Cable nationwide and several Los Angeles and Denver cable systems for an additional audience of 17 million a week. Again, the format for the PSAs was simple, just like the comic strip, in design and execution. But the impact, well, let's just say they touched a responsive chord. A cocaine high is hard to gauge because it'll lock you up in a mental cage. And when you say, I've had enough, a cocaine high will call your bluff. A PSA from Street Poet Ray. Forget the blow.
Tanya Huff wanted to be a fantasy writer. So what does she do for a living? Where did she get her job to start, to pay the bills? Waitress? No. Brain surgeon? No. She works at Bacca Bookstore, which is Canada's premier science fiction bookstore. Smart thinking, huh? Let's talk to Tanya. Tanya? Tanya? Hello? Oh, I'm getting something. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, it's Commander Rick up here. How are you doing, Tanya?
Pretty good, Commander Rick.
I wanted to ask you some quick questions here. Does it help working at a science fiction bookstore?
It definitely helps working at the bookstore. I get to see what's going on in the entire field. I get to talk to the people who are actually reading it. I get to find out what they want to read. I get to flog my own book.
All right. So when someone comes in and asks for Heinlein, you say, well, here's somebody else underage, and then you sell your book. Is that how it works?
Well, I try to sell them the Heinlein, too.
Any advice for a fantasy writer starting out?
Right, lots. Isaac Asimov had probably the best rules of writing I've ever read. He had 3 rules of writing, and they were read more, and don't give up your day job.
Your last book, the cover was a unicorn in a police car. Did you like the artwork?
I liked the artwork a lot. It was funny because the latest book, the one that came out just before Christmas, is an urban fantasy. And whenever anyone asked me what an urban fantasy was to illustrate it, I'd say it's a unicorn getting hit by a police car on Rosedale Valley Road. Well, this is the scene they chose to do in the book.
What's the difference between science fiction and fantasy?
Ooh, that's a hard one. The difference is blurring daily. I was at a World Fantasy Convention once with a room full of approximately 750 professionals, and at the end of a 2-hour discussion, it came down to it's fantasy if I say it's fantasy, and it's science fiction if I say it's science fiction.
You're best known for your books, but you've also written short stories, true?
That's true. I started out actually selling short stories. Yeah. I sold my first short story to Amazing back in, '83, I think. And then I sold a story to Magic and Ithcar, to one of the new phenomena in the field, which is a shared world anthology, where somebody, generally a name author, comes up with an idea and throws it out for the rest of us to exploit.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the markets that are around. For fantasy writers, there's a new place to sell stories, Marion Zimmer Bradley's Fantasy Magazine. They're looking more for high fantasy, good versus evil acted out through human agents. For sword and sorcery, blood and thunder stories, try Dragon Magazine. Dragon is a role-playing magazine, but in the last few years, they've started publishing short fiction, too. If you're more of a hard science fiction writer, send your manuscript to Analog Magazine. Their stories tend to be technical with less emphasis on character. Fantasy and science fiction magazines a tougher sell. They're the high prestige market for short stories because of their high literary standards, a real feather in your cap, but not much coin in your pocket. Isaac Asimov's fiction magazine was not created just to publish all of the stuff that Isaac prints, because if they did that, then they'd have to go weekly. Isaac only writes the editorial each month. The fiction here tends to be on the cutting edge. Lots of hot new writers like John Ford, Connie Willis, Pat Cadigan. The British equivalent of Asimov's magazine is Interzone. Give them a try. They're also looking for stories on the cutting edge. And there's a new short story magazine out, Aboriginal Science Fiction. Check it out, see what you think. Great cover. In fact, check out several issues of any magazine you want to send to. Do research. Oh, and if you're bilingual, there's 2 French science fiction magazines published in Quebec, Solaris and Imagine. And finally, the biggest market in terms of circulation, prestige, and of course, money, Omni. Of all the science fiction magazines, this one's in it for the money, but hey, they do such a great job, you have to respect them. They're looking for future stories, more upbeat. When you talk about hot Canadian writers, a lot of names keep coming up. One of them is Terry Green, author of Barking Dog. He's just, or probably was just sold his second book. Last time I talked to him, he said he had. I want to ask him some quick questions about Canada and Canadians. Let's just see if we can... Terry?
I'm here. I'm on the planet.
Hi.
I've landed.
A sec, I gotta lock you down here. This is getting static here. It's Commander Rick calling. I just wanted to ask you some quick questions. Canadian writer, living in Canada, working in Canada, but selling all over the place, in the U.S., short stories and books published here. And was your book, Barking Dog, published in the United States?
It was. It's published in New York by St. Martin's Press.
And there's no problem being a Canadian writer, is there? They don't care that much about where you're from.
No, this is great news.
Was it a problem selling a story setting in Toronto?
It wasn't. When I wrote the book, I was concerned. I thought I may be writing myself out of a market if I tried to sell it in the States, but that was never a problem. I discovered, much to my delight, that they seem to think Toronto is very interesting, even if people in Toronto don't think so. It is interesting, and you can make it interesting.
And you did, and you sold the book. Now, you've also had short stories published in a lot of the American magazines, but you've also been in something called Tesseracts. For people who don't know what that is, and should, and we all should, do you want to explain what Tesseracts is?
Tesseracts is an anthology that is published by Press Porcupine in Victoria, British Columbia. There was Tesseracts 1, edited by Judith Merrill, and published in October 1985, I believe.
Right.
I did have a story in that. It's Canadian science fiction. It's a Canadian publisher, Canadian voices, and a remarkable achievement.
That's great.
It was successful, and they did Tesseracts 2, edited by Phyllis Gottlieb and Douglas Barber, which I believe was published in 1987. I did have a story in that as well. It was a story that was originally published in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine in the States. But it, too, consists of a lot of new voices from the field, which are, again, entertaining and delightful to see, as well as some of the older names, such as, I believe, William Gibson is there. Margaret Atwood is in that collection as well.
Right.
There is going to be a Tesseracts 3.
Yep.
I'm not personally involved in Tesseracts 3, but I'm delighted to see the series continue.
Was Barking Dogs your first book?
It wasn't my first book. It was my first novel, Commander Rick.
Ah. What was the book then before
I wrote
that?
I had a book published in 1987, a short story collection. 10 stories were in it.
What was it
called The Woman Who Is the Midnight Wind, and
Right.
named after one of the stories in it. Coincidentally, one of the stories in it was titled Barking Dogs, and the novel that you referred to is an expansion of that particular story.
Right. Now, when Barking Dog came out, how long had you been writing science fiction at that point? How many years?
I think I started in the mid-70s, probably around 1975.
And you'd started through short stories, which not a lot of people do now. I keep hearing that the short story market is kind of overwhelmed. True?
I don't know if that is true, and I'm surprised that not many people are trying it, to be honest. It seems to me the logical route in is the short story, then the novel. I'm rather amazed at people who decide they're going to write a novel first instead of a short story. This is an overwhelming thing to me. I would never have tried it personally.
In July 1990, Rock Books will be publishing Shifter, The Chronicles of Galen's Sword by Garfield and Judith Reeves Stevens. These two are great. They write science fiction, they write fantasy, they even write straight science textbooks. They write anything. The point is that they write. I spoke to them just before they moved out to Los Angeles about how they broke into the market.
There seem to be two ways in Canada to get about getting into the business, and the first way is the traditional way. It works in Canada and the United States, which is write short stories, submit them to the magazines, build up your name that way, and eventually you'll get a following. And then when you submit your novel outline or your novel to the publishing house, you can say, I've had 18 short stories published in the last 3 years.
But that's a classic route.
We started...
We took a different one.
How did you do it?
I was...
You broke the ground for us.
Yeah, I was very mercenary. I wanted to write. I knew that from a very early age, and figured the best way to get into writing was to work in publishing. So I sort of directed myself at publishing. I ended up working for a bunch of publishers, and sure enough, the magic day arrived where I was doing work for one publisher in design, and the publisher mentioned that he would like to start a line of genre paperback, and was looking for horror and science fiction, and I told him an idea for a story, and he said, okay, I'll buy that. So it was really painless.
Now, I know nothing is unusual in science fiction, but is it a little strange for a husband and wife to be writing together?
It happens. Jan and Chris Morris, they write together. There's some, let's see, Peter Morwood and
Diane Duane.
Right.
For Star Trek.
Though they don't combine their names on those books because they want to keep them, they've developed other readership. And so they want to make sure when people buy a particular book with one person's name on it, it's going to be that type of book that people are buying.
Now, how do you guys write together? Does Judy take the right hand of the typewriter and you take the left hand? Here seems to be work at it, work at it, work. Oh, I'm losing you. Oh, shoot. Anyway, they're jamming me on the ground stations. I'm running out of power up here. I can't talk much longer. Listen, I guess all I want to say is that if you're really serious about a career in science fiction, in animation, in comic books, if you got that fire in your heart, nothing I say or anyone else says is going to stop you from getting through eventually. Hopefully some of the things you've heard here will help you along on the way. Anyway, good luck, keep trying, and hey, write if you get work.
Over around 20. For Wednesday, lots of sunshine. Cool, a high in the upper 30s. And for Thursday, mainly cloudy, breezy and milder. And a high in the low 40s, rain or showers developing again on Thursday. OI.
I'm saying